Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. First of all, if you're new here, I post new book reviews almost every single day, so if you're looking for some reading inspiration, if you're looking to follow book reviews, then feel free to stick around. Second, if it looks like I'm glistening, it's because I'm glowing. Just kidding, it's because it's 92 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 34 degrees Celsius, something like that. So it is hot and I'm sweating and I have the fans running, but there's only so much I can do when it is this hot, as evidenced by the fact that there is a melting cat in my background. So we're doing the best that I can with what I have. I do not control the weather, and we're going to talk about a book today. Ironically, for the fact that I spent the first part of this video talking about the weather, the book I am reviewing is Peter Wohllebens' The Weather Detective. Now, I checked this book out of the library because I recognize the author's name. And I do find with nonfiction, I tend to have less pull around an author. So with fiction, if I recognize an author or I like an author's writing style, I will intentionally seek out that author in the future. For nonfiction, I tend to look for topics. So maybe I'm interested in ancient Mesopotamia. Maybe I'm interested in learning how to garden. Maybe I'm interested in ancient Egypt. I'm looking for a category more than I'm looking for a specific author. Now there's nonfiction authors that I do love, but I find that pull of the author to be a little less strong when I'm reading nonfiction. However, I read, I think last year, Peter Wohllebens' Forest Walking, which I really enjoyed his perspective on just enjoying and taking in and reading the natural world around us. He is a forester located in Germany, and I just really enjoyed that book. So when I saw this book in the library on the shelf and I recognized his name, I decided to give it a read. So that's going to tie into the first thing I talk about, and that I will get back to how those two things kind of merge in a minute, and that comes down to expectation. So I do think that a lot of times when we read a book, we come in with a lot of expectations, even if we don't know anything about the book or the author. In this case, I knew the author. I had a guess at what this was going to be about, but I feel like a lot of people, when they pick this up, will expect a book primarily about weather. And I feel like a lot of the times when I, at least personally, rate a book maybe a little lower than I should, or not should, but maybe a book, if I had had the right expectation going into the book, would have been rated higher. If I went in, I'm thinking about another book I read. It was something, I forget the main title. The subtitle was like Learning Math at the Edge of Old Age. And I think it received a lot of lower ratings online due to expectations, because people thought it was a book teaching you how to learn mathematics at an older age, but it was actually more of a memoir of a man's journey learning mathematics at an older age, as opposed to a list of resources and ways to learn math at an older age. So I feel like when you have an expectation going into the book and the book doesn't live up to the expectation, even if the book in and of itself is a very enjoyable book, then it tends to color your review of the book. Where if you knew what the book was going into it, you may have had a more correct expectation, and then you may have enjoyed the book more instead of just being surprised that the book wasn't matching your expectation. When I saw this book online, or when I added this book online to like my list of books I'm reading, I did notice that there were some lower reviews in the mix. And normally I do not look at reviews for books, especially not before I read them, because I don't want someone else's review to maybe color the way that I look at a book. I do, however, like to sometimes look at book reviews after I read the book to see if people drew the same conclusions that I did, but I really don't like to look at book reviews in general because I don't want their opinions to color the way that I viewed the book. In this case, I just happened to notice some were a little lower, and after reading it, I feel like I know why, and that's because my expectation going into this book was that this book was going to be about weather. It says The Weather Detective. However, this book is primarily, there's some interesting tips about weather, but it's mostly about gardening and how you can use things like the weather, or how the climate, or how things in the past, or how different plants or different animals impact and affect your garden. It's mostly gardening tips. Additionally, because this is written by the forester who lives in Germany, they are going to be European gardening tips from a European perspective, primarily for a European garden, although the general principles can be applied to a garden, I'm assuming anywhere in the world, definitely in North America where I live. Something that I do find interesting is this book was originally published in German, and it has been translated to English, and that's the version that I read, and the original title in German was not The Weather Detective. So I'm not sure if this was just a poor translation or a poor choice of title for the English book. And not that The Weather Detective in and of itself is a poor title, but I think if there was something that clued the reader in a little bit more that this was going to be a book more about gardening, you may have captured a more correct audience. Because when you don't have a correct or a very good a title that's indicative of the content of the book, not only are you getting people who maybe aren't interested in gardening who pick this book up thinking it's more of a pop science book and then being disappointed, you're also losing what word is that? You're losing the audience that wants to read about gardening who may not realize this book is full of gardening tips. That being said, once I kind of readjusted my mind frame when I realized this was more about gardening, and again, gardening is not a hobby I'm actively engaged in. I'm in an upstairs level apartment right now, so there is very little garden space, and I don't really have too much of a green thumb. I still found the perspective very interesting. Weather patterns just are a little different in Europe. It's a different part of the world, as well as things like what animals have adapted well to living in a city and what animals are invasive. And particularly one point I found invasive, or that I found interesting, is when Peter Wohlleben is talking about invasive species and he mentions the blueberry bush, which is native in the North American continent, which is where I live. So for me, the blueberry bush is not an invasive plant the way that he talks about it, but it is very interesting to get a perspective on the European climate, the way that it impacts gardens, different animals and plants and things to know if you have a garden in Europe. I do think that's very interesting. I just think this was a book of misdirected expectations. And I feel like because I shifted very quickly and was like, okay, this is a gardening book, this is a book about gardening tips, and I'm just going to approach it that way, the book became very enjoyable. 3.5, 4 stars. It's not too long, it's under 200 pages, I believe. So it is very enjoyable, but I think maybe the fault here lies with the translation team, the publishing team, whoever picked this title basically, because I feel like it kind of, you're losing part of your audience that would read this and you're also disappointing the other audience that picked this up. So overall, I just think that there could have been a little bit more work put into the title of the book to kind of manage expectations up front to get the correct audience reading the book for this author. Overall though, I enjoyed it. It was just kind of fun tips, just little tidbits here and there, the kind of thing that you might remember something when walking through the woods, or if you do have a garden, if you do live in Europe and you do have a garden, I think maybe a lot more of these tips would be applicable as opposed to trivia. In my case, a lot of this is going to be trivia. It's either discussing animals or birds or plants or things that do not live in the United States, at least not natively, or tips that don't really apply to gardens, or things that are just different. But I found it full of very interesting facts. So if you do live in the North American continent or anywhere else besides Europe, I think it'll be interesting to read from more the trivia pop science perspective. And then if you live in Europe, you might be able to glean a lot more applicable practical tips for your garden from this. So overall, I think once you get your expectations right, this is a very good book and it deserves to be rated highly, but I think knowing the expectations for this book going in is going to give you a much better reading experience of this book going in. And I think maybe that isn't Peter Wohleben's fault. Maybe there just needs to be a little bit more thinking and better decision making around the way to market and title this book in the English translation of this book. Overall though, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good book and I'm glad that I checked it out. And I'm just hoping to give some perspective and some context in case you're looking to read this book so you know what to expect going in, because I think knowing what to expect going into the book will give you a little bit better idea of what you're going to read and hopefully avoid some of that mismanaged or misplaced expectations. Please let me know if you've read this book, if you have any thoughts on this book, if there's anything else you think I should be reading that I haven't read. I love to get your opinions. I'd love to get your suggestions. I'd love to read your comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.